Okay, I think we're about ready to get started here. Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Overdose Investigation Tips. I'd like to start with a couple of reminders. This session is recorded. It will be available on the conference platform 1 hour after the session ends. Please keep yourself muted unless you are asked otherwise. And make sure to join the sessions live today because we will be doing a prize drawing from attendance in each session. The conference is also offering free continuing education credits. For more information, visit the continuing education page. You can ask questions during the session in the chat or raise your hand either way. I'm excited now to introduce Skip Jacobs. Skip.
Hey, thanks for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about a subject that, unfortunately, we're having to deal with here in the District of Kansas. Just to introduce myself, I'm an assistant United States attorney in the District of Kansas. I'm currently officed in the Topeka branch. I handle a little bit of everything, but over the course of the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity, I guess you would say, to handle some overdose prosecutions as well as some overdose investigations that we weren't able to get to the prosecution phase. And currently, our opioid coordinator, Mona First, is on detail to the District of Columbia for the Capitol riots cases. So I'm filling in as the district's opioid coordinator. So I'm a point of contact for any assistance you may need or questions you may have concerning opioid overdose investigations or other types of drug-related investigations that the U.S. Attorney's Office or local law enforcement may need assistance on. So the first big test today is to see, can I share my PowerPoint? And I think I can. Are we good, Patricia?
Yes, that looks good. You might want to, yeah.
Let's do that.
But I can see it. Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect. So the title of this class is Overdose Investigation Tips. Really, you could change the word tips to topics or aids or things to think about, and it's really intended to give you somewhat of a broad overview of different topics or aspects about overdose investigations you should be thinking about, or you should be maybe consulting with local law enforcement on and developing strategies to bring more prosecutable cases to either state, local, or federal law enforcement or federal prosecution.
And Skip, we can see your notes too. Can we change the display settings up there at the top?
Yeah, how do I do that?
So if you go to display settings, just click on that little tab up there at the top. Right next to end slideshow.
Okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And then you could just swap presenter view.
Is that it?
Very good. Yes.
Okay, cool. As we go along today, if there's things that you have questions on or something for the good of the group, please feel free to speak up. The point here today is not for me to necessarily get through the 5 big tips that I think you should be thinking about. It's for you to take something away that was useful. I'll tell you up front, I'm not the subject matter expert on overdose prosecutions. I don't really know any of us are at this point. If we start with kind of tip 1, which is know the operative law, there's a little bit of a background to that. If you've spent time in drug-related investigations or the history of kind of drug use in the country, what you see is kind of cyclical events. So maybe cocaine's really popular for a decade, and then its popularity wanes, and then it picks up again. Same thing with heroin, same thing with marijuana, etc. What it appears happened in that kind of cyclical event is when we recodified the Controlled Substances Act that includes prosecutions for overdoses resulting in death or overdoses resulting in serious bodily injury. That statute was codified at a time where heroin use had kind of waned in popularity. So as the opioid epidemic really started to kick off in the 2000s and later on, and heroin came back, and now we've got fentanyl and fentanyl derivatives that are becoming ever more popular. That statute prohibiting, distributions resulting in death or serious bodily injury hadn't really been used a lot, because we don't oftentimes see serious overdoses that result in death or serious injury coming from methamphetamine or cocaine base or cocaine powder or some of the other drugs that we use. It's oftentimes our opioid or narcotic based drugs. And so the development of the law right now is still, in terms of legal precedent, still relatively new. And it's important, I think, if this is something that your department or a department you're advising is going to be taking up these types of investigations, it's really important to get with your county attorney, district attorney, or the U.S. Attorney's Office if you're looking at federal cases on a regular basis and consult. Because ultimately, as kind of new statutes, if you will, or statutes that haven't been used a lot, as they get used more and more, they get more exposure to the court system. And then we start developing law on, what exactly is it that you have to prove when it comes to causation? What is it that you have to prove when it comes to the actual substance? Did the defendant need to know that it was heroin when he thought it was methamphetamine, or vice versa? So there's all these kind of developments that we see a lot, particularly in Kansas. In preparation for this and some other things, I looked at kind of the body of law that relates to overdose deaths or overdose prosecutions federally, and we've got a pretty good line of precedent at this point. So I think, have a pretty good understanding of what are our proof requirements, what we should be doing to build better investigations. But when I started looking and researching into Kansas, there's just not a whole lot of appellate law about that statute, about the Kansas overdose statute. And so that, to me, says we're not using it a whole lot. But if we continue to use it, or we start using it with any kind of regular frequency, we're going to start developing law and rules and that will change the way that we need to structure our investigations. So I'm a big believer in, if you're conducting investigations of really any kind, but particularly of more complex bodies of law, it's a good idea to consult early with the prosecuting office that's going to be handling your cases, and consult early. The other thing I like to tell people is, sometimes I think in law enforcement, we make our job a little more difficult than it needs to be, and we overthink things sometimes. So every crime, basically, in the state of Kansas or in the United States, has jury instructions, right? And for those of you who might not be familiar with it, jury instructions are the law, if you will, that the court reads a jury at a trial. So it's the way that a jury who doesn't have any real legal experience most of the time is instructed on what the law is. And they literally read like recipes. It'll say the government has to prove the following. First, that the defendant X, Y, and Z. Second, that the defendant X, Y, and Z. Getting your hands on those, and they're public documents. You can go to the 10th Circuit if you're looking for federal law in Kansas, or you can go to the Kansas Court of Appeals if you're looking at the state law. getting your hands on those, I think are huge tools that are overlooked, oftentimes because the officers that I talk with just simply don't know that they exist, nor would I necessarily expect them to know it. But it's literally a recipe, a go by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, do these things of proving your case. It also helps if you are dealing with a county attorney, a district attorney, or an assistant U.S. attorney who maybe doesn't have any experience in this area, or maybe is a little hesitant at taking an overdose prosecution. It helps because now you're able to explain it in the lawyer's language. You're able to explain to them, okay, well, here's the elements, here's the things that you're going to have to prove if we take this case to trial, and here is the evidence I have on each one of these things that you have to prove. And so I think, in my experience, and I'm not, singling anybody out, I think there generally on the state level is some reluctance to take these types of cases, and quite frankly, it's because oftentimes we as prosecutors, we don't want to be that person who did the thing for the first time and set some kind of bad precedent. So I think we tend to be a little more conservative as prosecutors when we're looking at branching out into new crimes or new areas that just haven't been used very often. So being able to have your investigator or the law enforcement officers or your detectives or whoever talk in a language that the attorneys understand and kind of walk them through, this is what we want to do and this is why we think it's okay, I believe to be a very helpful way of getting your prosecutions in front of or getting your investigations in front of a prosecutor and on to the next phase. Lastly, each statute that we deal with, at least in Kansas, the federal or the state, has a causation requirement. In federal court, that causation requirement is but for. It's a very, very difficult standard oftentimes to prove. And basically the way it works is we have to show that a particular quantity of drugs that a particular defendant distributed to our victim is what caused them to overdose. And that sounds kind of elementary, but we're dealing with drug addicts oftentimes in these types of cases. And it's not unusual for them to have more than one substance in their system when we do an autopsy or we do an analysis of a blood sample. And so that makes it difficult to say, this heroin or this fentanyl or this pill or whatever the case may be is the but for cause of their overdose incident, whether it's a death or a serious injury. Understanding that and understanding kind of that standard by knowing the operative law will assist you in making sure that you're collecting the right evidence, understanding some of the time-sensitive nature of some of the evidence, which we'll talk on the next slide, and making sure that from the beginning, we're putting together a case that ultimately we can get through the court. I'll reference some of them as we go along, but in the last probably 3 years, I've helped out on some really well put together investigations that at the end of the day didn't go anywhere because for one reason or another, I couldn't meet this but for standard. And it's difficult, and it's you always hate when you get almost to the finish line, but you can't get all the way there. But knowing the operative law and consulting with your local prosecutor is probably, I think, one of the most important things that you can do. Any questions on this topic before we move on to the next one? You see any, Patricia? All right, next. Okay, the second tip, and this is more focused towards, detectives or officers that are going to be investigating these types of cases in their departments. I recommend treating overdose investigations like homicides. The reason I say that is because there's a certain, in my experience, both at the state and federal level, there's a certain level of detail and specificity and attention that gets paid in homicide investigations that doesn't ordinarily otherwise get applied to some other cases, right? So you're probably not going to call out a full CSI and have a litany of detectives show up for somebody writing a bad check, right? It's just not resource wise, it's not feasible. Overdose investigations, because oftentimes they are involving, or they do involve a death, and the drugs, if you will, or the murder weapon, I think it's critically important that they be treated as if it were a homicide. Now, I know internally agencies have, stats and clearance rates and things like that. I'm not suggesting that you internally classify overdoses as homicides. I'm just suggesting that you take the same kind of care and attention. One of the things that really parallels well between homicides and overdose investigations is that kind of first 48-hour mindset, in that some of the most critical evidence and time-sensitive materials that you're going to get are within that kind of first 48-hour period. The next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about what some of those things are, but blood samples usually tend to be things that, especially if the person doesn't expire, if they survive, by the time that incident gets reported to a detective who can go to the hospital and get the vials of blood that they took from the victim, the vials of blood are already gone, because most hospitals have about a 48-hour or so retention policy. Second is witnesses. It's been my experience that when a person is kind of in the throes of an overdose, particularly amongst kind of the opioid user community, who understands, at least to a certain degree, the severity of these types of things, people tend, at least in my experience, to be more willing to talk to you as it's happening, because, or shortly thereafter, because despite the lifestyle that they're living that would cause them to be, associating with heroin or fentanyl or whatever users, they're usually have some concern about the victim's well-being, and they're likely to talk to you, or I guess be a little less on guard and talk to you. But then what I've seen is later on down the road, when we start talking about, well, maybe you're going to have to testify to grand jury, or maybe you're going to have to testify to trial, they tend to be more likely to recant. They tend to be more likely to say, I don't remember anything, this never happened, I don't know what you're talking about. Because now that we're not in this emergency situation anymore, they've reverted back to their general, I don't like to be around law enforcement. So one of the things I've found that helps a lot in these types of situations is to record interviews of basically anybody you talk to at the hospital or at the scene of a death, or that's around, is to record those, because that can help us out later on. So far, with I think one exception, every case that I have done, there's been some material around the decedent's body, or that was on them when they went to the hospital, that has enough drugs on it that we can test it. This is really important because if you're working in a situation where you're used to executing a lot of, narcotics type search warrants, or other type of narcotics types investigation, there's a lot of things that you might not ordinarily seize. You might not ordinarily seize syringes. You might not seize snort straws. You might not seize or be too concerned about the little bit of residue that's on a mirror where people have been snorting drugs off. In overdose cases, that's massively important because as part of the consulting the law and understanding what the law is, the government has to prove exactly what substance it was that the victim overdosed on. To put that into perspective, I had a case where the victim survived and reported that they had purchased heroin, used it, and overdosed. We did recorded phone calls with the victim's supplier who admitted selling the victim heroin. We did a recorded phone call with the victim's supplier's supplier that said, yep, I gave you heroin. But there was no way of proving that she actually had heroin in her system. One, because there was no seizure of any paraphernalia or materials, snort straws, syringes, any of that when the overdose occurred. And the panel that the hospital used, the toxicology panel, couldn't tell us whether it was, it could only tell us it was an opioid. Couldn't tell us if it was heroin, fentanyl, oxycodone, whatever. So we had a very strong evidence that this drug distribution occurred. We had overwhelming evidence that it caused her to overdose. We just had no evidence to prove that it was in fact heroin and it wasn't something else like fentanyl. Also, going back to the talk we had earlier about the but-for causation standard, again, we have to show that it was that specific substance that caused the overdose. And so if you find any valid prescriptions laying around, it's good to get those too, for two reasons. One, there may be a interaction between the drugs, or alternatively, there may be no interaction between the drugs. So your expert would be able to say they had a prescription for, I don't know, 800 milligram ibuprofen. Well, opioids and ibuprofen don't react that way that would cause an overdose. And so we're good. The other thing is, if you find valid prescriptions, they're going to have a provider on there. And so what I like to do is, once I find out the provider, is get all of that person's medical records from their provider. Because not only do we have to prove that, the but-for causation as applied to maybe other substances, but also to in some instances, to their medical well-being as well. So if you had, congestive heart failure and no doctor would ever give you opioids because it would cause you to die, and you snort fentanyl, well, you're probably going to die. So did that fentanyl kill you? Yeah, but was there some other underlying medical condition? And that may not matter, or it may matter, depends on the circumstances. But those prescription bottles, I've found more often than not, actually come in handy. These days we live in a digital age. We probably have more personal information about us on our phones than we actually do in our house. And where I have had success in being able to prosecute these cases, it's almost inevitably come down to we have some type of phone, social media, or other type of communications between our target, our defendant, and our victim. So to the extent that you can exploit those, that's important. What I would suggest is more important, at least initially when you're responding to these, is to figure out what providers they're using and what social media they're using and get a preservation request in. That way, later on, once you've developed the case a little better and you can get search warrants and other judicial process to actually get the contents of these things, we know it's not been destroyed. We know it's not going away. It's been preserved by the provider. Lastly, and I think this gets missed all the time. So to the extent you can pass this message along, I would very much appreciate it. Don't forget to interview the first responders, the EMS and the fire. The EMS people and the fire people, oftentimes in an overdose incident, are going to be the first ones to show up on the scene. Sometimes they might get there at the same time as law enforcement, sometimes not. But they're oftentimes the first one to get at the scene. And no one interviews them, and no one asks them to make a report. And sometimes the things that they can tell you are extremely important. The types of symptoms that the victim was experiencing can be indicative of a heroin or opioid related overdose versus, let's assume they did too much meth. When you're talking about knowing our operative law, I think most people at this point are familiar with Narcan and its ability to reverse some of the effects of an opioid overdose. Typically, our federal law says if medical intervention was necessary to save the person's life, i.e., administering Narcan, that is sufficient to prove serious bodily injury. And so who's most likely to administer that? Well, it's our EMS and fire. And so don't forget about those people when it comes time to interview or collect evidence of. All right, any questions on this before we go to the next slide?
We had one from Todd who asked, based on case law, can you tell us what constitutes serious injury for the purposes of charging a non-fatal overdose?
Yeah, so serious bodily injury is one of those fantastic lawyer terms that sounds like it would have a very straightforward definition. It's more squishy than that. Typically, the one that we rely on the most is, was there some sort of medical intervention necessary to prevent death? So it's not as explicit, but it's kind of in that same kind of but for idea. If it wasn't for the EMS tech administering Narcan or the surgeon doing surgery or whatever the case may be, if it wasn't for a medical practitioner administering some type of aid, the natural course of events would be for this person to expire. So that's the first bit of it. The other thing, which I'm going to say, I think this is consistent with law in other areas. I haven't really seen it in overdose cases because I don't, I'm obviously not a medical expert, so I don't know that opiates necessarily can produce lifelong kind of injury. So, but ordinarily in serious bodily injury in general would include anything that would cause a kind of permanent or debilitating injury or illness. And so, again, I have no idea if this is even humanly possible, but let's say you snort some fentanyl and it causes your left arm to be paralyzed. That would probably constitute serious bodily injury.
Okay, that's all we have for the moment.
Okay. All right. The third thing, and I'll kind of move through this one a little bit quicker because part of it kind of goes without saying, but I think it's a good idea to establish positive relationships with your local hospitals. If you're in a small county, you may only have one, or it might be in another county. If you're in a larger jurisdiction, you may have multiple hospitals. Especially if you're doing a lot of these types of investigations, and you've got one or two detectives that you've kind of tasked at taking these types of cases, it's a good idea to get a positive relationship with the local hospital. One of the things I've noticed, and I understand why they do it, is when I subpoena records from hospitals in these types of cases, I usually get a call from their legal counsel. And their legal counsel is all concerned about what I want the records. Now, if I was the legal counsel for the hospital, I'd be making the same call too, because maybe I want these records because it involves fraudulent billing. Maybe I want these records because I'm trying to say there was some malpractice. Once I tell them that it's an overdose investigation and it doesn't involve anything to do with the standard of care that you've provided, they're always very willing to assist us. But after a few iterations of that, in one particular jurisdiction where we were doing a lot of these types of cases and a lot of subpoenas, the hospital got to know the agent. The hospital understood that when this agent comes in with subpoenas from Skip, it's an overdose related case. Or they could check real quickly internally and say, oh yeah, this person was here on an overdose related matter, so that's what this has to be related to. So it's really good to establish positive relationships. And some of the things that the hospitals can help you out with, and again, this is all about relationship building and then understanding, their requirements when it comes to HIPAA and things like that, is early notification of overdose incidences. So if they get someone come in for an overdose, like we had an instance where a gentleman went to the hospital for an overdose. He was treated, he was Narcaned, he was released, and then like 6 hours later, he's back at the same hospital, another overdose. And actually, the hospital was able to notify law enforcement of this, and we came to find out that it was a counterfeit pill making organization that were giving out fake oxycodones laced with fentanyls. So they can sometimes provide you some early notification. They can also help with preserving blood samples that they would otherwise destroy. And this is kind of important point to understand in this investigative phase. If in my experience, now every jurisdiction is a little bit different, so I haven't done cases all across the state, but in my experience, if someone dies from an overdose, typically an autopsy is done and a toxicology panel is run. If a person doesn't expire, if they're taken to the hospital or some other medical provider, they will also run a toxicology panel. The difference is the toxicology panel that they do with autopsies, in my experience, is much more specific in terms of it will break down exactly what type of substances were in their bloodstream. So I can look at a tox report from an autopsy and it'll tell me that they had X amount of nanograms of fentanyl in their bloodstream. They had X amount of nanograms of heroin metabolites, whatever the case may be. The tox screens that I typically or routinely see where it's a person going to the hospital for an overdose in which they survive, the tox panels simply are kind of a positive negative. So most of the times it'll just say methamphetamine negative, opiates positive, cocaine negative. I can't do anything with that. Like, I can't prove what a person did or what a person used with that type of a tox screen. But the blood samples that they collect when they do that tox screen oftentimes will be retained for a short period of time. Sometimes it's 24 hours, sometimes it's 48, sometimes it's 72. If we know about it quick enough, or you get a relationship with them quick enough, we can ask to preserve those blood samples, and we can take possession of those blood samples, and we can send those blood samples to the DEA lab or the FBI lab or the KBI lab, and they can give me exactly what was in their system. The other thing with that is, as we see more and more designer drugs coming from kind of fentanyl derivatives, it's getting more difficult to test for all of those, because the panel that they use may not have a standard for carfentanil or acetylfentanyl or whatever the case may be. And so sometimes, occasionally, you've got to send things out to private laboratories or contract laboratories for specialized testing. I haven't personally seen it, but I've attended trainings where they've had someone overdose, Narcan was administered, they had a response to the Narcan, and either the drugs or the blood was sent for testing, and it showed no controlled substances because it was some fentanyl derivative or some other opioid derivative that particular lab didn't have the ability to test for. So that can be a make or break piece of evidence, that creating those types of relationships with your local hospitals and staff will assist you in that they know if Skip calls and says, hey, I need you to preserve Joe Smith's blood sample, I'll get you legal process on this, then they know I'm going to get them legal process on it because we've got that type of relationship. The next part of that is, with building relationships, understanding what type of process they will take. Will they take a subpoena? Are they going to be difficult and insist on you having a search warrant? Are they going to fight you on every subpoena that you get? Are there things that you can just, maybe if it's not covered under HIPAA, that you can just informally acquire from them? Can you call them up and say, hey, can you just tell me whether or not you have records on this person? Getting those types of positive relationships with the local hospital will aid in that process and make it go more smoothly and more quickly. Lastly is determining whether they will secure hazmat materials, or under what circumstances would they be willing to secure hazmat materials. As I said earlier, I've, with one exception, I think every case that I've worked, we've been able to find some paraphernalia or some residue or some piece of substance either on or near our victim's body. And so if they've got, the snort straw that they were using to snort heroin in their front pocket, and their front pocket has some kind of biological material on it, and so they've stripped it off of them and thrown it in the hazmat bag, there could be a really important piece of evidence within that. So will they secure those types of things for you at least long enough that you can say, yeah, we want it, yeah, we don't want it, we're not going to search it. It's, maybe it's, depending on the circumstances, it might be something that is too hazardous, you don't want to search it. But again, that there's always some piece that we can submit to testing and get a determination on what type of drugs they used on their body or around their body almost every time. All right, any questions on that slide before we go to the next one?
Nothing at the moment. Go right ahead.
Okay. The next, so I got two more tips. The next is creating internal policies and checks. I'm a checklist fan. I think that's because I spent most of my 20s and early 30s in the Army, and we had a checklist for everything. So one of the ways I think checklists help, particularly with these types of investigation, is it's not uncommon for your trooper or your patrol officer or the guy or gal that's doing routine stuff to be the first responder and actually take investigative actions, take some of the first investigative actions on these types of cases. And having a checklist for that officer to go through until, you know, your narcotics unit or your investigative unit or whoever is interested in this gets out there can make a really big difference. There's at least one agency that I work with that uses kind of a checklist. It's kind of bare bones, but it makes sure the right people get the right information and the right type of stuff is secured. And it's made a pretty big difference in some of the cases and investigations that we've worked for. So there are checklists available with the Department of Justice that are just generally been developed. I think there's one out of the District of Maryland that gets passed around, and certainly I'll have my contact information at the end. You can send me an email. I'll be happy to send it out to you. In fact, some of the bullet points that we've gone over today, I pulled from their checklist. Considering screening criteria for investigations, I mean, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to investigate each one of these. They are time consuming. They do require some expenditure of resources and money. So we're not going to be able to do every case that is an overdose. And so understanding, again, kind of the things we've built up to this point, do we have the ability to test someone's blood? Were we able to get some paraphernalia or substance around the body or on the person when they overdosed? Can we prove, is there some hurdle that's going to cause us to not be able to prove but for causation that we can identify right off the beginning? That's good, because then, you know, those cases where at the end of the day, we're never going to be able to make work, let's not spend our time and resources on that when we can focus on other ones that we can develop and we can make a prosecutable case about it. And lastly, you know, for internal agencies and departments is, you know, most police departments that I work with, or federal agencies for that matter, have, you know, they're compartmentalized to a certain extent. And having those clear guidelines, which usually you can put into a checklist on who is the person that needs to be consulted with, or what's the department I need to coordinate with on these, is, you know, in some degrees really critical, because otherwise you can miss out on very important evidence or information simply because internally the departments are not coordinating with one another, and not because of some dysfunction or anything, just because maybe you just don't know who to talk to, you don't know who to ask. So those kind of 3 bullet points, I think, when you're looking, if you're an agency looking at itself on how to make your agency better when it comes to these types of investigations, those are really, I think, the 3 things that you can focus on to make some pretty big differences. Any questions on this tip before we go to our last thing?
Let's go on.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so I consider a task force or a working group approach. Really, this is more kind of outreach focused. it's a component of understanding your community. So do you have a large enough population and a large enough incident rate in your community where you need an ongoing working group or task force? And really one of the things I want to focus on that is oftentimes when you are dealing with particularly, well, really, if you're dealing with bad doctors or you're dealing with street drugs, it's going to be a small group of people that are ultimately responsible for bringing in the bad dope, the dope that's getting everybody sick, the dope that's killing people. One of the cases that I have in litigation right now, we had multiple overdoses, and they would seem on the surface at least to be disconnected. But once you started piecing the puzzle together and officers and agencies started sharing information with one another, you were able to bring it back to this core group of just a handful of folks that were ultimately, networking these drugs all out all over the community. And so if you're seeing, if you've got the right amount of population and resources to get a working group or a task force going, you can target those people that are ultimately the most responsible for what's going on in your community, instead of what we usually end up doing in these cases, and that's just picking the people off of the edges that, for better or worse, are subsistence dealers. If we think about drugs as a business and as a logistics, a stream of logistics or commerce, the victim who is using the drugs and ultimately dying or getting seriously sick from them, they're not buying from the kingpin. They're not buying their retail 1/10 of a gram of heroin from the dope kingpin. They're buying it from somebody who has just one tiny extra layer of connection than they do. And what we want to do is we want to get up there to the really bad guys. We want to get to the people who are manufacturing the drugs, who are putting the fentanyl in the heroin, who are putting fentanyl in Xanax pills that's killing people because they have no opioid tolerance. And so I think that's important. My suggestion would be, depending on your population and who you work with, you have your investigators, someone that represents your patrol people, someone from a prosecution office, whether that's your county attorney, district attorney, or U.S. attorney. And then, depending on the nature of the discussions, if we're talking about case specific investigative tactics, we might want to keep it all law enforcement. But if there's other community groups that you can do in kind of a more general setting, oftentimes they will have a better ear to the ground than we do, because people are less likely to talk to law enforcement than they tend to be other persons who are out and providing social services in the community. That kind of ties into what we really want to do is ultimately build cases on distribution networks and dealers before the incident occurs, right? So once a person is dead or has already overdosed, in some respects, we're already too late. Now, are we going to stop all of those? Absolutely not. No way. But if we are understanding our community and understanding who are the bad guys in our community, we can disable or at least, thwart some of these networks and some of these groups before the drugs hit the streets, or before all of the drugs hit the streets, right? And lastly, prevention and awareness. We talk about that a lot. This conference is kind of part of that, prevention and awareness, and we're doing that, and that's good. Where I put kind of a sub bullet there on counterfeit pills. I think counterfeit pills to me, and I'm simply a prosecutor. I'm not out on the streets every day as a law enforcement officer. They are what worry me the most. When I think about, trying to convince my kids not to do drugs when they get older, it's the counterfeit pills that concern me, because they don't know that it's counterfeit. I mean, some of these pill press cases that I've worked, unless you tested it, you wouldn't know that this isn't oxycodone. And unfortunately, the supplies and the materials and the presses and all the things you need to make counterfeit Xanax and counterfeit oxys, which tend to be the more common ones, they're not that difficult to get. A lot of times you can get it off of eBay. So if, I think it's important, at least in our prevention and awareness points of view, if we can get into schools or other at-risk population and explain to them, the problems that pills, particularly opioids in general, but pills particularly cause, we may be able to prevent some of these overdoses that occur in our community. One of the cases that I've prosecuted, essentially, without getting into all the details of the case, basically the victim was a college student and was really kind of researching and reading up a lot on the opioid crisis, and thought, well, let me try some heroin and see what it's all about. Turns out it wasn't heroin, it was straight fentanyl. And, he died. First time he'd ever used a hard drug, 19 years old, he's dead. And it makes me wonder if we could have got out there and maybe in the community a little more and explain to them, really what is going on with the different fentanyl strains that they're creating and how they're using that as the active ingredient in a lot of counterfeit pills. We may be able to stop some of these things before they occur. So that's my presentation. I have my contact information up. That's my office line, as well as my email. Feel free to email me or call if you have any questions or follow up, or if there's some resource that maybe I can get you connected to. I'm more than happy to help at any time. And with that, I'll hang out and see if anybody has any questions.
We did have another question come up. Do you
Yeah.
feel like overdose fatality review teams could be of use?
Yeah, I think so. I think, one of the things, these are hard cases and it's hard to get them right. But it's not unlike other cases where, we make mistakes, or maybe we don't get everything that we need to get. And if you do something right 100 times, you're not going to learn as much as if you do something wrong once, right? You're going to gain more experience from failure than you are from success. And so, to the extent that one, it involves reviews of cases that we've actively investigated, certainly we can really hone our skills. To the extent that it reviews, we look at, maybe we look at statistics and death records, or the coroner provides us data on how many people are dying. I think that's also helpful in that it can, one, depending on how many autopsies we're doing, it can help us establish what's the most likely type of substance that's being distributed. And then secondly, it can help us kind of focus on networks, because one of the things that I've found is oftentimes it's not an exact science, but oftentimes different groups will distribute drugs containing different mixtures. So maybe this group, this group's putting fentanyl in their heroin, and this group over here thinks that they're putting fentanyl in their heroin, but they're really putting, carfentanil in their heroin. And those autopsies, if we're doing the right toxicology panels, can show us what are the exact substances that are being used. So if we're seeing multiple deaths or we're viewing these types of circumstances, then maybe we can help target exactly what networks it is that we want to go after. Hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, please let me know.
I'm seeing none, and I don't see any more questions in the chat, but if
All
anyone
right.
wants to unmute and ask anything, you're welcome to.
Okay, well, I appreciate everyone, you all having me here today. I hope the conference goes well, and I'll stick around for the next couple minutes in case anybody comes up with something.
Thank you very much, Skip. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Patricia, thank you for your help today.
You're welcome.
Hopefully everything goes smoothly. The rest of how many, is today the last day or is it all week?
I think this is it. I've got one more session here today, at least that I'm helping with.
All right, cool. Well, nice to meet you.
All right, you too. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.